How can we turn off the propaganda taps? That is the focus and question for our episode today with Dr. Gary Sidley. So in tonight's episode, we are going to be evaluating the psychological tactics that the government and the mainstream media have used over the past 18 months and continue to use, I might add, to ask, have they been, is there a justification for their use in the sphere of public health? My guest today to explore these issues is Dr. Gary Sidley, a retired clinical psychologist with over 30 years experience working for the NHS. He's an outspoken critic of the government's coercive handling of the pandemic. He questions the ethics behind the covert psychological tactics driven by the SPI-B team at Sage, and seemingly with the blessing of the British Psychological Society, which we'll unpack during today's conversation. He argues that in the UK, we have not been told that a deliberate, emotionally charged campaign of fear, shame and peer pressure has been purposely used against us to gain our compliance for non-evidence public health strategies such as lockdowns and mask mandates. His writings on this subject can be found on the Corona Babble blog, which you can find at www.coronababble.com. We'll share the links as we go through here. So join me tonight as I discuss with Dr. Sidley whether these psyops tactics, this propaganda, can ever be justified when used in the name of protecting public health, and what practical steps that we can take to protect ourselves from being psychologically manipulated in this way. Gary, great to have you on the podcast tonight.
Good to be here, Dan. Thank you for inviting me.
So firstly, would you mind just giving us a bit of context around your own background? Someone who's worked in the NHS, you've got a long history of looking at psychological aspects of health. Could you just give us a brief overview of your career?
Right, I'll try and keep it very brief. My first university degree was actually in the proper sciences, biochemistry and physiology. I graduated back in 1979, I think it was, with biochemistry physiology degree. But then my interest in mental health developed. I entered psychiatric nursing, initially as an untrained, unqualified nursing assistant, but then I did my nurse training, and through the first half of the 1980s worked as a psychiatric nurse, mainly in the large psychiatric institution. 1987, I switched to clinical psychology and qualified in 1989, and then spent my career then working in the NHS, predominantly with adults with severe mental health problems. In the last decade, I was a consultant psychologist, so therefore involved in other things like professional leadership and senior management teams for my sins. I opted for early retirement in 2013. Spent some years after that as an active mental health campaigner trying to promote alternatives to biological psychiatry as ways of responding to human distress. Published my book, Tales from the Madhouse, 2015, which was a critique of psychiatric practice. And then, of course, from the beginning of last year, 2020, my interest was grabbed by the COVID-19 narrative. And since then, I've been working very hard with lots of other people to try and put forward an alternative viewpoint and try and broaden the debate. As you know, some of that has been with HEART, the Health Advisory and Recovery Team. And I'm also recently involved in the Smile Free campaign, smilefree.org, which is campaigning for mandates around masks to be lifted and for them never to return. So that about just sums up my career in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Gary. Now, I'm very curious to know, was there a defining moment that caught your attention during the response to the campaign from a psychological point of view or a behavioural point of view, where you thought something's not quite right here, or this isn't responsible public health approach?
I don't think there was one kind of moment. I think from the very beginning, to be honest, Dan, from February 2020 when COVID first emerged, I was very much worried about the direction in which we were travelling. And I think some of that was because my career in the NHS, one of my speciality areas of interest was around risk and risk aversion and safetyism. I've spent many a a fruitless hour arguing with infection control and risk management groups who were just ultra cautious and just thought they had to minimize risk at all costs. Whereas I often argued that working with people with mental health problems, you often had to take some calculated risks to try and improve quality of life and to try and enable them to progress and move forward. And so you used to have endless battles of that type. So I think I already had a certain leaning towards being a little bit suspicious of public health and infection control and anything to do with risk. So I was very uncomfortable from the outset, and started then to do a little bit of research of my own, looking at flu and what the incidence of flu and how many people die of flu a year, and started to make comparisons. So my suspicions were raised quite early on, and interestingly, when I expressed them, which I did, I kind of lost a few friends and a few colleagues, and I was accused of being some kind of insensitive individual who didn't care about these people dying, which of course was couldn't be further from the truth. And my stance from the outset has always been about minimizing total harms, both from the actual virus and from the restrictions that we've imposed. So there was not, to answer your question much more specifically, no, there wasn't one sort of moment when everything became clear. But it was just a gradual build-up, but pretty early on in the process, like I said, February, March 2020.
Yes, great to hear you talk about minimizing total harms. That's the exact phrase that I use here on the podcast, which is about exploring every aspect of this, recognizing that we do have a virus, but actually if that's the only harm that we're focused on, then I'm known for saying if you try and protect just one tree, you'll never save the whole forest. It's going to take a broader focus in order to do that.
Yes, Dan, I agree, and I've always argued that if we strive for a risk-free life, that life is often one not worth living. It's not, the quality of it isn't satisfactory. Life is a risk. Everything that we do, from crossing the road, engaging in sport, going down the pub, even opening a champagne bottle, there's a risk involved in this. But we, at some level, decide that it's safe enough, and we go ahead and do it. And I think if we do get so hung up on trying to eliminate all risk, I think we get ourselves into some difficulties very quickly.
Well, I'd be interested to unpack that a little more as we go through, because one thing I'm noticing right now is some people's behaviors around when they get sick now. There's almost an instant fear that they've got coronavirus, firstly, but even then when they find that they're sick from something else, or just got a common cold or hay fever or any other type of illness, there's this almost fatalistic attitude towards their own health, and the fear of infecting others, because we've now been bred into this culture that we don't just look after ourselves. We in many ways, in the context of this, quite rightly do seek to protect each other, particularly the vulnerable. But now there's this almost fatalistic fear around sickness, which I'd like to come back to. But this other point around removing risk, I had another guest on the show who said that, you can eliminate domestic violence to practically zero if you put CCTV in every home of every room of every house. You can eliminate road traffic accidents if you eliminate cars and vehicles. You can eliminate a lot of things if you take this zero-based approach where you eliminate the behavior. But as a result, as you say, as a consequence, you live in a surveillance society. You erode what many of it means to be human, and you go from living to existing. And we have to find a better way to get a balance, I believe. You spoke about cultural safetyism. What have been your observations in the years preceding the pandemic around this concept? And do you think that's played a role in the way that we've seen the response to the pandemic?
I think it's contributed, like a number of factors have contributed. I think over the years we have become a little bit more kind of obsessed with risk elimination, this expectation that we should be living risk-free lives. As I mentioned before, I witnessed a lot of these in the NHS, the mental health domain, where risk management groups, were in the ascendancy, and to do anything even slightly innovative, you had to get everything passed through these risk management groups, which were very bureaucratic and took an age to come to any decision. Just one example off the top of my head, working with a gentleman who'd been in an institution, psychiatric institution, for a number of years, and he was doing very well, and he felt that engagement in some voluntary work would be really useful, and we tried to get him fixed up with some voluntary activity, but then the risk management group started to ask questions about, when he was 16, which was 40 years ago or whatever, he committed a relatively minor sexual offence, and you think, well, okay, yeah, there haven't been any hint of that, 40 years now. We'll be mindful of that, but should that then deny this gentleman the opportunity of getting involved in some voluntary work, which would do him good, will contribute positively to society, and help him progress and move forward? And these were the kind of arguments that I find myself in on a regular basis. Somebody with obsessive anxiety problems, for instance. I don't know whether people who were very concerned about contamination, and some people who were very concerned about inadvertently doing harm to others. These are people who suffered with severe obsessive problems were the kindest people in the world, in a way. That's why they suffered. They desperately didn't want to hurt anybody, so hence their obsessive problems evolved. But yet trying to get the risk management groups to see that these people were at the end of a spectrum of being more safe than the average person. It's virtually impossible, because they're having thoughts about these distressing thoughts about hurting people. So, well, yeah, that's because they're desperately trying not to even think about that, but they get the rebound effect, and they're getting these thoughts that are invading their consciousness. So we used to have arguments like that incessantly. So yes, and I think there has been that increase in this expectation that we should all be able to live this risk-free life. And safetyism, I think, has been growing over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, so interesting enough, a couple of years back, one of my business mentors used to talk about how risky is the new safe, and I kind of like that as as an entrepreneur, at least, which is it's not a cavalier attitude, but it's this understanding that life does come with risks, and often, certainly in business, that risks potentially has a higher payoff. But I appreciate we're talking about public health here, and perhaps the analogy isn't really suitable. But the idea now as well, this almost OCD-like behaviour for people. Before we talk, some of the things we'll talk about today in terms of the behavioural aspects and some of the propaganda type material that we've witnessed, has led to almost this collective health anxiety within society. What have been some of your observations around this from a kind of clinical psychology point of view?
Well, I have to point out that I've not been working on the front line of clinical psychology for a few years now, so I've not been working with patients with these problems. I speak to other colleagues who have, and they tell me, unsurprisingly, that people who have suffered beforehand with health anxiety and obsessive problems have been very badly affected by the restrictions and the approach that we've used. So it's almost as if, if the country was led by evil leaders who wanted to create as much distress as possible, what would we do? We'd create uncertainty, we'd put people into social isolation, and we'd start to scare them about the risk of infection and the risk of dying and the risk of hurting other people. And that kind of combination is really important, I think, in aggravating people's mental health problems, and particularly those who already were prone to be overly worried about contamination and overly worried about their physical health. Again, over the years, I've worked with many people like that, and And I know sometimes the health anxiety gets a bad press, people do hypochondriasis and it gets a bit dismissive. But people's lives have been ruined by severe health anxiety and obsessive compulsive problems. It really is a major issue that impacts on the individual's life and that of all the family. And I just think the approach that we have used in many ways has been anathema for that group of people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've got first-hand intimate experience with that. My wife suffered with health anxiety following the loss of her mother for several years, where, she would essentially, her mind would lead her to believe that she's got cancer and all kinds of other health ailments. She'd be looking for the signs and triggers, and it became a real physical manifestation. She would start feeling sick and unwell. She's been through all kinds of therapy and different forms of counselling to overcome that, and she's made incredible progress right now. But she has just written a blog on this, actually, saying that what she's witnessed is almost like health anxiety being inflicted upon a population through some of these fear-based approaches. Whether it's inflicting fear or shame, but not just inflicting the fear and shame on society. We've seen this peer pressure and scapegoating around some of the measures as a way of influencing behavior. It's been hard to witness what we've seen, and as someone who has an understanding of human behavior through my previous work also, and not question the ethics of the government's approach here. So let's dive into the ethics now. Is it ethical for a government to inflict fear in the way that it has over the past 18 months or however long it's been now, in the face of a pandemic or a crisis like this?
Well, unsurprisingly, I think not. It's very unethical, and I think using there's three main nudges that the behavioural scientists have used in the communication strategy for COVID. One is fear inflation. One is shaming, where they've actually done a really successful job at making following restrictions akin to being a decent, worthwhile human being, and vice versa. If you don't follow restrictions, you're not. And normative pressure or peer pressure, which of course can easily morph into scapegoating, which exploits the idea that we are influenced by what we believe the majority of people around us are doing. And we like to follow the majority. This is the idea with our fast brain versus slow brain. Most of our life we spend it in automatic pilot, with our fast brain being in control below our level of consciousness. And it makes multiple decisions moment by moment, which usually are quite efficient. But of course, the behavioural scientists exploit this. They know that fear produces a population that's compliant. They know that shaming is a potent way of making people comply to avoid feeling shamed. And normative pressure and scapegoating is a very powerful tool. And I do think that the ethics of these approaches is very questionable. And they're questionable, I think, on three main fronts now. If I could just outline what these are.
Please. Yep.
Yeah. I think they're unethical, or there's some ethical questions that must be asked about the methods per se. Is it right for a civilized, democratic society to deliberately and strategically inflict inflated fear, shame, and scapegoating, or at least peer pressure, on its citizens as a way of getting them to do what the government wants them to do, even if that's around public health? So I think there's a real debate to be had about that. That to me sounds more in keeping with an approach that authoritarian regimes like China might wish to use. So there's something about the actual methods themselves. Then there's the consent. Should we be using these approaches of behavioural science without the public's consent? Now, it's interesting on this because Professor David Halpern, who you may know is a real leader in the nudge approach. He's written about it. He sits on the SAGE group and the SPI-B group. And some of his publications, he has actually acknowledged very explicitly the need to get people's approval and permission to use these approaches. I can read some of this stuff out if that might be helpful. For instance, in the Mindspace document, which was in 2010 Institute of Government document that he co-authored, he talked about policy, and I quote, "Policymakers wishing to use these tools need the approval of the public to do so." And even more kind of obviously he states this in his book, Inside the Nudge Unit, which was in 2019. And I quote, "If governments wish to use behavioural insights, they must seek and maintain the permission of the public. Ultimately, you, the public, the citizen, need to decide what the objectives and limits of nudging and empirical testing should be." And that's Professor David Halpern, who sits now on the SAGE group. So I think there's ethical questions about the methods per se. There's ethical questions about getting the public's permission to use these kind of approaches, and I think there is a third area about the goals as well. As you know, behavioural science has been around for a long time. It's only since 2010 that it's been so prominent amongst government departments, but it's been around a long time. The genie's out the bottom. You know, these approaches have been used in a wide range of areas and probably still are. But there maybe is still an ethical debate to be had about whether there are some red lines around, you know, the goals in which we use these approaches. You know, for instance, you know, I don't know, the general public might be more on board with the idea of using some of these approaches to reduce violent crime, as opposed to getting conformity with some contentious, non-evidence for the most part, public health restrictions. So I think those are the three main ethical questions for me, Dan.
Yeah, and they're very important questions to ask. I'd like to unpack some of those a little bit. I've just finished reading actually The People versus Tech by Jamie Bartlett, which for the first part of the book, fascinating book by the way, talks about behavioral science and its emergence from as it's developed over the years through advertising and marketing and how it's been used to sell products. But more recently, how it's been used essentially to sway elections through various campaigns based upon algorithmic approaches, understanding human behavior, understanding different triggers and applying different nudges in order to essentially manipulate people to vote in a certain way. So we know how powerful these tools can be with nudging. Now, the question around ethics of using nudging and these behavioral techniques inside of a crisis is an interesting subject, because on one hand, you've got the sense that, okay, we have a potential threat. How do we put policy or regulation in place that seeks to mitigate the harms posed by that threat to some extent? But then, you know, if you take it back to the world of advertising and marketing, there is a clear ethical line where you could be deemed as mis-selling or, you know, inappropriately selling. Now, how do you judge where that line is? Because one of the things I've noticed about this entire response to the pandemic, and there's been some articles written about this in America, in New Zealand, and various other places around the moralization of policy, where which has the effect of people being unable to really rationally and logically challenge the policy because the moral weight of the argument carries such strength that it becomes difficult for people to challenge. So how does one assess the morals and ethics of decisions in the face of a public health crisis? Because, you know, some people might say they're doing it for the greater good, but who can determine what is for the social good, and who has the right to make that decision?
I mean, those are very good questions. I suppose the bottom line for me is let's have the debate. You know, let's have the discussion. As you mentioned earlier, the British Psychological Society, you know, in response to me raising some concerns and 46 other psychologists and other mental health specialists raising concerns, don't seem to think there's anything worth discussing about this, which I find quite astonishing. Let's have the debate. I don't think they're easy questions to answer those. And I know even people on my side of the debate around being rather sceptical of the dominant COVID narrative will have different views. I've come across colleagues who think that we should never use any kind of covert strategy that acts below people's level of awareness, that anything's unethical of that nature. People like myself are a little bit different. I think the genie's out. I think they are going to be used, and maybe they can be used for some good in some contexts and some situations. But we do need to have that debate, and there are ways of gaining people's consent about this and having that debate. This isn't new territory. Consent, for instance, is the cornerstone of any clinical practice, whether you're a psychologist or a medic. And you will not deliver an intervention unless you have the informed consent of the recipient. But yet, here we have the behavioural science lobby and the psychologists within it, actually delivering this intervention to the masses without any consent at all, without any debate, and then claiming there's nothing ethically questionable to talk about, which I find quite astonishing. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are red lines. In my view, I can see a role for behavioural science. It's been around for a long, long time. Used to use it myself back in the 1980s, 1990s in some interventions with clients. But there are some approaches I think that we can use. But I think we need to have the debate, and I do think that one of the main priorities now is to push to see if we can have some kind of independent inquiry into how we use nudging within our government departments, maybe around public health, but also around some other areas as well, because they are being utilised in other areas other than public health.
Well, I think this is an important question that you've raised, because certainly, excuse me a second. If the behavioural techniques and nudging has a intent to change the way you think or to elicit some form of action, then subconsciously, then you take this kind of excuse me.
You all right?
I'm all right. Paternalistic. It's like this paternalistic approach whereby the government kind of assumes that it knows what's best for its citizens. And when you're in that situation, without debate, without discussion, it becomes very, very difficult, and the role of the state takes on a very technocratic form. And I think we've witnessed this in the last 12 months, particularly, where the government has taken on that paternalistic role. But if you use the analogy of parenting, there are many different forms and styles and techniques of parenting. And, some of them are questionable, and some of them, with the very assumption that the parent always knows right. Although, if you're referring to teenagers, I was a teenager who always thought he was right. But, that's I've subsequently learned that I wasn't. But parents don't always know best. And that parental style of the paternalistic style of governance, whereby they're using behavioural techniques and nudges to effectively elicit a certain response or action, as I mentioned, you have to ask the question, does the government really know best? And without debate, how do you come to that conclusion? What is for the greater good? The phrase used at the beginning of this conversation around the total harms. Well, just on the behavioural techniques alone, some of the spillover effects off the back of the nudging is the mental health crisis that we're now living in, on one hand, but then you've also got the policy, the spillover effects on policy itself, which, there's a ever growing list, whether it's endless hospital waiting lists, whether it's the erosion of the economy, whether it's devastation of livelihoods, whether it's the decimation of social gatherings, and the list just goes on and on. There's huge collateral harm. So how do we have that discussion? How is it possible in the future crisis? What can we do differently when it comes to ethics?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with you about the paternalism and this idea of some kind of common good that we need to always be directed by, because who decides, as you said, what is good and what isn't? There could be a whole range of views on that. And as we know from history, paternalistic tyrannies, doing it for our own good, are often the most dangerous. With regards to your specific question about how can we achieve some kind of consent or have that discussion, one of the interesting models that has been used across the world is something called deliberative forums, which you may be familiar with. I don't know. Where the idea being that you bring a few hundred people together for maybe a long weekend and discuss it and discuss the issue and feed all kinds of expert information into the process. You obviously make sure that your group is randomly selected from the population, and you kind of in detail discuss it out in a constructive manner. This has been done many times around other issues across the world with some good effect. What you tend to find is that what starts out as a polarised debate tends to become less polarised as you discuss it in that civilised, constructive way. So I think the key for me is that there are ways in which consent can be obtained. You can get the public's permission to determine where you do draw those red lines, because that is an open discussion. There's no definitive. It must always be here. I think it is open to debate, but let's have the debate and let's involve the public in that, rather than just imposing this paternalistic, we know best, this is for the common good kind of mindset, which I think is, a slippery slope personally. I think that's, this authoritarian regimes that we've witnessed in the 20th century tended to have that kind of, we're going to deny individual rights and the rights of minority groups for the benefit of the whole, and we're going to decide what those benefits are and who benefits and what our overarching goals are going to be. I think that's a very dangerous slope to go down, and I fear that's where we're heading at the moment in this increasingly authoritarian approach that seems to be being adopted.
Well, I agree. I think what we've witnessed, and I saw an interesting analysis of this the other day, where it talks about how collectivism in itself is not a problem, but when collectivism is pursued at the expense of individual rights, and increasingly so, where the individual rights or liberties are compromised, you start to that becomes a trigger for totalitarianism or authoritarian style approaches. And I think we've seen a gradual move towards this more paternalistic collectivist mindset, which again in itself there is certainly a role for that. If it's all individual rights and all individual priorities, and we don't pay attention to social requirements, and that's an issue too. But both can coexist. But what we've seen is this dominance of this collective approach, which I do believe has drifted to that more authoritarian approach, where I do think people need to consider the long-term ramifications of that, because, when it's this technocratic environment where the greater good is assumed by, or the moral authority is assumed by the state or big tech, all of a sudden you've got this situation whereby, you have this kind of almost social credit style system where every behavior is tracked, traced, and judged. There's a value judgment on it. And without debate, without discussion, all of a sudden individual rights crumble under that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Danny. I think it is a slippery slope. And this kind of assumption that somebody, presumably the government, knows what the common good is and what we should all be striving for, is really a troublesome idea, and one that I do think is a dangerous approach to take.
But particularly in the context where we've seen the democratic index reach its lowest point since its inception around the world, globally during the pandemics. At least where there is high levels of democratic standards, where populations are represented, then at least there is some safeguard against that type of approach. But as democracy erodes and totalitarianism or authoritarianism rises, that moral authority is more rapidly assumed by the state, and therefore the actual segments of society don't get to input into that discussion. We have not seen that discussion throughout this year, the last 18 months. And I do wonder, Gary, if there was a focus group that had occurred prior to the pandemic where some of the propaganda, some of the campaigns, some of the billboards, some of the government advertising had been shown to focus groups, whether they would endorse the use of that. My assumption, my hallucination would be absolutely not. You'd get some abstraction of that, where some people who are more safety focused would perhaps endorse those. But I think under normal rational thinking, when we're not in a perpetual state of fear and we're back in that conscious equilibrium, I don't think we would tolerate that type of behavior. But do you think it has been tolerated by the public and therefore normalized?
I'm not sure whether tolerated is the right word. I think people have obviously not consented, I beg your pardon, they've complied. Yes. They've gone along with it through a mixture of fear, avoidance of shame, avoidance of being scapegoated, I believe, and being the odd one out in a crowd. Because I think the other thing to highlight as well, Dan, though, with these approaches, with the use of fear, inflation, shaming and scapegoating, it's the collateral damage, and not just in terms of mental health, as I think you mentioned, which is very important, of course, and businesses and people's livelihoods and the knock-on effect of that. But the actual collateral damage as far as contributing to the excess non-COVID deaths, of which, of course, we've had already tens of thousands of those. It's something clearly, for example, fear inflation has made a significant contribution to that. People have been too frightened to attend a hospital with non-COVID diseases. They've been too frightened to take the acutely unwell children to A&E. We've had elderly people, dying prematurely of loneliness in their own homes. There is a collateral damage in terms of lives, associated with some of these techniques as well, which should be discussed as part of the process of looking at these approaches and whether they're legitimate or not.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. It strikes me as thinking about, again, using the term spillover effect or cost-benefit analysis of policies. These collateral damages, these collateral consequences, the second-order consequences of decisions, it just doesn't feel like they've been evaluated in terms of the risks that these measures can create. And we've also got the problem of short-termism in the sense that any politician or minister or prime minister or premier has a limited term. Therefore, they're never going to have to pick. It's the same with the company CEO who's in place for 4 or 5 years. They don't have to deal with the consequences of their actions over the long term. The reality is, what we've seen over the last 18 months is actions that have short-term harm, but also very profound long-term consequences, whether that's mental health, whether that's the hospital waiting list, the economy, placing the burden on the next generation in many ways. But one of the classic examples of this, I think, is the mask mandates. Became a very contentious issue, and lots of questions around whether there is evidence for their efficacy. And I actually did speak to one of the SAGE advisors who informed me that it's well known that there are, in the world of engineering at least, there's an unsettled debate around aerosols and droplets, which are essential components when you actually evaluate transmission, the mechanism of particles and how they operate in the air, and therefore, in context of viruses, transmission. But there's been no recognition of that. The same SAGE advisor told me that essentially the government took one side of that debate, which completely then ignored the other side of the debate and discussion, and informed their decision around mask mandates. Now, do you think that was a well thought through policy that is evidence based, or is this another behavioural tool as a way of driving compliance?
Definitely the latter, a compliance device. We know back in the beginning of 2020, pretty much all the public health bodies, all the specialists, public health specialists, were all saying masking the healthy is not a sensible thing to do. It will do more harm than good. We shouldn't do it. And then, of course, round April, May, June 2020, all that flipped. Suddenly, it became, mandated even that people must wear these things. in public places, in community settings. So without doubt, to me, it was a compliance device, and it's a very effective one as well, hugely effective one. You know, we mentioned normative pressure, how humans tend to be very much influenced by what other people are doing or what we believe they're doing. So you can impose normative pressure on people in its simplest form by informing them that almost everybody else are complying with the restrictions, or 90% of people are in agreement with vaccine passports. You know, this is quite potent normative pressure. But the scale of that is nothing compared to what you get with mass, because with mass you've got a very blatant visual indicator that you can detect instantly that says that person is a conformer to the rules and that person isn't. So it's hugely powerful as a compliance device. As for evidence for viral transmission, I think that argument will go on and on and on. You know, there's evidence out there that masks do reduce viral transmission. There's evidence out there that says it doesn't reduce viral transmission. I tend to gravitate to the latter because I think the strongest experiments, the randomized controlled trials in real life settings, tend to point to the fact that masks, particularly as worn by everyday members of the community, do not significantly reduce viral transmission. But in some ways, I think we can put that to bed, because in a way to mandate masks, for me, the evidential bar would need to be much, much higher than that. It would have to be clear that it was saving many lives, and we're miles away from that. The other thing that people forget with the mask argument is that they assume that it's a benign intervention, but it's not benign at all. It has, the research is still in its infancy, because we haven't had masking the healthy within Western democracies very long, but already a range of physical problems that are emerging. But on top of that, there are things like, increased falls in the elderly, excluding 1 in 5 of the adult population who struggle with their hearing difficulties from the social world, and most importantly of all, the social and psychological development of our children being impaired by these things, and as we've already discussed, the perpetuation of fear, and inflated fear. Masks are very potent at doing that. They're a blatant signal that danger is all around. One of us is a biohazard, so danger is proximal. But as I've argued in other areas, masking also acts as a safety behaviour. This idea that any psychologist or cognitive behaviour therapist knows, you want to overcome fear, you overcome avoidance, and you get among the thing that you're frightened of. In this case, getting back into normal everyday human activity. But if you do that wearing a mask, you can go for several weeks interacting with other people. Everything goes fine, hunky-dory, not eventful at all. At the end of that 3-week period, you tend not to then think, life must now be safe enough for me to return to. What tends to happen is it becomes a near miss. The mask just about saved me. I managed to get away with it this time. And thus the fears are perpetuated. So masks are so wrong on many different levels, and in my view are one of the most insidious of all the restrictions. I get quite passionate about masks because I just think they are just so unhelpful.
I'd be remiss of me not to talk about the use of behavioural techniques and nudging within the context of vaccines. I've had many different doctors and scientists on here who have campaigned against the lockdowns and other restrictions, but have got mixed views on the current set of vaccines. I don't necessarily need to get into the vaccines themselves, but what about the ethics of using nudging or behavioural techniques when it comes to what would traditionally be seen as a medical choice, with the principle of bodily autonomy at least? What are your views on the ethics around what we've seen in terms of some of the things around incentivization, this kind of threats, coercive tactics, behavioural? This for me feels like another one of those areas where someone has decided it's for the greater good, therefore these behaviours have been normalised or accepted or promoted. What are your views in the context of this area?
I think you've answered it there yourself. I think they're grotesque. Every decision as to whether to inject something into your body should be an individual one, based on informed consent, where you're given all the information about the risks that you are being exposed to with the virus, the risks of the vaccine, potential benefits of the vaccine. Individuals should then weigh them up and make an informed choice. Again, that's the cornerstone of ethical clinical practice. And all that's been discarded. We're giving people burgers and bribing them to get the vaccine, or emotionally blackmailing the young people with threats of you won't have access to to the nightclubs or to pubs if you don't get vaccinated. I think that is outrageous. And some of the nudges that we used around that, talking, some of them weren't particularly nudges as shoves. They were pretty grotesque, weren't they? Pretty blatant.
Yes.
They're telling young people, this was advice from the NHS, but telling staff should tell young people that they or other people in society will not get back to normality until you are double jabbed. That's outrageous. Each person needs to be able to have the time and the information to weigh up whether it's in their interest to have the vaccination or not. That's what happens in civilized societies. That's what's happened for as many years as I can remember in clinical practice. And all that's just been discarded. As you said, with the common good, this idea that the government and the authorities know what the overall arching aim should be, and everything else should be relegated to achieving that.
Yeah, it's what frightens me the most is how quickly things become first normalised and then secondly moralised. We started with 3 weeks to flatten the curve, and I think most people got on board with the idea at the first sense that okay, we'll let the hospitals prepare. We don't want them to be overwhelmed. Get their stuff in order. In retrospect, people can certainly question that logic. Many did question it at the time, but nonetheless that was accepted, but then it was moralised, and the same with lockdowns. Lockdowns became normalised, they became moralised. We had 15 million jabs to freedom. Everyone accepted that idea. Yep, we'll protect the most vulnerable. Makes sense. It becomes normalised, but then it becomes moralised, and then it becomes moralised that every living soul becomes vaccinated, and then that becomes accepted, and then it becomes very difficult for debate and questions and any concerns to be levied, because there is that moral weight, that ethic, where the ethics have been decided for you.
It's a bit like what the behavioural scientists call the boiling frog, doesn't it? It might sound a bit grotesque, but it is. But if you drop a live frog into boiling water, it will immediately jump out. It won't have it straight out. If you put a frog into tepid water and incrementally increase the temperature, it won't move until it dies when it reaches a boiling point. And that's what's happened with the way that these things have been brought in. They've been brought in one kind of increment at a time, and it's only for 3 weeks. It's only this. It's vaccine passports. It's only for foreign travel. People then accept that, and then the next increment comes in, and the next one, and before we know it, we are living in an authoritarian, China-like social credit system, which is what my fear is at the moment.
Yeah, same. I think that fear itself around that was seen as a kind of a fringe fear, but all the mainstream papers are writing about it now, which it says it all. It's all in plain sight. If you just type in, look for any of the reports that have been written about digital IDs and the billions of dollars and pounds that are being spent to develop these tools and techniques. Not from fringe areas. You've been talking about the big four consulting firms talking about the future of these things. It's no secret this is the direction it's heading.
What's the difference between the conspiracy theory and the truth, isn't it? Like 12,
yes.
18 months, it seems to have some truth, doesn't it? If you spoke about these things in 2019, you would be called, quite rightly, I think, a conspiracy theorist, and you shouldn't worry about those things. You're going down the rabbit hole, but worryingly, a lot of these things are now happening. And I think we have to stop to it.
The question, there's lots of questions around the idea of conspiracy around that, because again, even 2019, you look at the industry trends, from the Gartner Magic Quadrants and all these, big think tanks and reporting agencies that kind of project where the future of the world is heading. It was evident in 2019 that this is, but again, it's not public it's not in the public sphere, so therefore it's not normalized, and it feels like a fringe idea, even if the tech is being developed under the in the background. The kind of final furlong of this discussion, how do we turn off the propaganda taps? Firstly, you mentioned that the British Psychological Society, they've rejected the idea that there's any form of malpractice in terms of the ethics involved in this. Turning the taps off, how do we define that? Is there a way to put pressure on the government and the units involved to say, look, enough's enough, we need to now deprogram people out of the fear? How do we get out of this? How do we turn off the propaganda taps, and how do we recover from it?
Well, I think there are a number of ways, and I'm aware that I've got a lot of time, but I think there are several approaches we can take. First one is quite obvious. I think we have literally got to turn off the mainstream media. I think we've got to actually limit our exposure to propaganda, and the mainstream media has been appalling throughout this, I believe. So minimise your contact with that. Get out and about. Get out into nature and focus on the moment rather than worrying about the future and the past. Be mindful. Read things rather than watch videos all the time. And all those things do one thing. They get our more rational, deliberative mind into action rather than us being on automatic pilot all the time. I think there are other things we can do as well, though. And I read a wonderful blog recently. You may be familiar with it, Dan. Can't remember what's the guy's name. Julius Ruchel.
Yes.
The Canadian fella. Have you come across him? He's really good.
Yes, very much. Very good, yeah.
Well, I was a bit late to the show with this one, because I've only found him a couple of weeks back. But he talks about this illusion of consensus. We've got to break this idea that there is consensus out there, that almost everybody is totally on board with the restrictions. Because in reality what's happened is that there will be a cluster of people who are very much on board with the restrictions. They clearly are, who are not going to be influenced. But I'd argue there's a bigger group of individuals in the middle there who are like the silent ones, who are just going along with this to either avoid hassle or because they're too scared. So I think we've really got to break this illusion of consensus. And I think there's two main ways of doing that, just very quickly if I can get this in. I think one is by enabling them to reduce their fear. I talk about this on my Corona Babble blog and my recent Corona Babble blogs, my propaganda detox plan. In a nutshell, that often involves people actually ditching the mask, getting back into normal life. I'm not talking about being reckless now. If you're absolutely riddled with symptoms and highly vulnerable, you make your own risk kind of evaluation. But by and large, if it's safe enough, you get back out there, you mix with people, you hug people, you handshake, you do all the things you used to without a mask. And that's probably the most potent and maybe even the only way of reducing people's anxiety. Some people may want to do that gradually. We talk about this on the blog, step by step, incrementally. But by and large, that's what we've got to do. We've got to enable people to reduce the fear. The other thing we've got to do, I think, is encourage people to speak out. Because as you'll know from your knowledge of this Julius Ruchel and his blog post, I think he's absolutely spot on. I think it's no good being silent about this now. It's no good, being anonymous on social media. I think in our own little space, we've got to have these conversations, either with our friends, colleagues, family members. And I say that, in knowledge that I'm in a very lucky position. I'm a retiree. I've got much less to lose than a lot of other people out there. A lot of my colleagues who've been braver than me and spoken out are now being kind of ostracised, attacked, in many cases disciplined. Nurses, psychologists, medics who have spoken out are often facing disciplinary action. So it takes bravery to do this. But I think all of us in our own little spheres need to start having those conversations. And I think there are ways we can approach that. I'm not talking about us all going around calling everybody stupid. and that you've been fooled and you need to wake up. And that doesn't tend to influence people. People just become more entrenched. None of us like to be told that we're wrong, do we?
Definitely,
None of us like to be told that we've been stupid. What we need to do, I think, is find common ground. There will be some common ground. If you ask, even people who are pro-lockdown, I find it quite fruitful to ask friends, is there any aspects of the restrictions that you're not 100% comfortable with, that you think might not be totally justified? Questions like that actually get people to highlight bits of ambivalence, bits of kind of areas, and you can then go in and have a conversation about that and then share some of our information. Because we know that data is not going to shift this alone. If data was going to work, all this would have disappeared last summer. Data is not going to work. It's secondary. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You've got to get people to doubt, to actually start voicing those concerns. And when they do, and the government and others can see that the majority, an increasing group of people are being vocal about this, some evidence that it only takes 10% of people to be noisy and things start to tip, then I think other people will join in. And then I think we might have some success in stopping our descent into authoritarianism.
Absolutely, you make some really good points. I've just started reading a book by a guy called Adam Grant, which is called Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And he talks about, in that book, finding that common ground as a starting point, because what we tend to do is we kind of try and hammer people with the facts to try and influence them in that way. But actually, as you say, it actually causes people to retreat further into their existing position. And actually, we've seen that with the whole situation has become tribal. Us and them, divide and conquer, which plays into the compliance. It plays into all the problems we've talked about. So trying to find that common ground, I think, is really important, and ask more questions than make statements, because often when people question their own thinking, they will find the gaps. In which case, then there's an opportunity then to talk about some of the things that you've discovered. So I think this is a war of influence, really, which can only be won by empathizing, finding common ground, and involving people in that public debate, because we just haven't had one. And whilst the doors are open to us now to circulate in society, it's time to have those one-to-one conversations, because my experience has been that many people are more skeptical than certainly people have been led to believe through the manipulated surveys and whatnot that you see on YouGov.
Yes.
So you send a real message of hope there. Now, for those who are have been watching this and exploring this subject for themselves, is there any parting wisdom that you can give to help them with either helping bring that get a greater connection with their families or whatnot, where they've got divides in their family and friends group? Is there any parting wisdom you can give to help people kind of restore those connections and have these conversations?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because even with friends and families, just leaving aside the work situation, which I think is awful at the moment for many people, the level of censorship within the professions is just outrageous. But we don't like to disagree with our friends and family. It's awkward, and I don't know about other people, but my instinct is sometimes to avoid them, people who I know disagree with me. And I feel quite angry with them about them just complacently sharing twee posts on Facebook when all this is going on. I think, come on, guys, wake up and see that. So instinctively, I try and keep, the inclination is to keep away, but I think that's unhelpful. I went out with a group of friends recently that I'd not been out with, and it was a constructive thing to do. And I'm going to go out with another group of ex-colleagues next month, which part of me is not looking forward to, but I think will be a useful thing to do. And I encourage your listeners to have those conversations. Not to go in like a bull in a china shop, and not to try and shout people down, even though tempting it is sometimes. Because if data was going to sway the day, it would have done so by now. It's not sufficient. We need to get people's minds, and we need to get people to shout out. Just look for that area of ambivalence. In almost everybody, there will be some ambivalence. There'll be some aspect, whether it would be the rule of six or the one-way systems at the local supermarket or whatever. There'll be something that's irritated them, or they don't see quite the sense of it. And I think, like open-ended questions, start to ask about that, find a bit of common ground, and then you can gradually increase your input and start to share your experiences and maybe a little bit of information as well in there.
Indeed, and hopefully lift the lid of trust on some of the things that have gone before us. Yeah. Gary, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you here on the Pandemic Podcast. We've been here with Dr. Gary Sidley tonight, former NHS consultant clinical psychologist, giving his perspectives on the ethics of the behavioural science and nudging that we've seen, and also how to turn off the propaganda taps. Please do check out his blog, fascinating blog, coronababble.com, where he unpacks these types of conversation that we've been having tonight in depth. So please do check that out, coronababble.com. And thank you again to Gary, and for our live audience who have participated in this live conversation tonight on asking the question, how do we turn off the propaganda taps, and where is the ethics amongst all of this? So thank you once again, Gary, and thank you to our audience. For those of you who are watching live, please do take a moment to subscribe to the Pandemic Podcast. It will just take just a minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic, whereby you'll join our mailing list so we can keep you up to date with forthcoming interviews like this one, including our interview this week with Julia Hartley-Brewer on Thursday lunchtime, following our previous attempt at interview where I got cut off for 90% of it, and she hosted the show herself, the Julia Hartley-Brewer takeover. And I've got a live session with Nick James tomorrow, who's an entrepreneur, to explore some of these subjects and explore how I went from entrepreneur to activist. So look out for that tomorrow as well. So please do subscribe to keep up to date with the latest content. And thank you to all for tuning in to the Pandemic Podcast.